They called them rumors, urban legends, the kind of stories you whisper in dim kitchens and then laugh away in daylight. Mind control experiments. Secret bacteria sprayed over a city. Doctors who watched a disease progress and took notes instead of curing it. For years, these sounded like conspiracy theories, until the files surfaced. Declassified memos, budget lines, meeting minutes stamped with dates and names. Not every wild claim is true, but some of the strangest ones were real. Tonight, we're not chasing shadows. We're reading the paperwork. Before we open the vault, one rule. Conspiracy theory is a shifting label. It can mean three different things: a claim that's false, a claim that's unproven, or a claim that's true but sounds unbelievable. We'll stick to the last category. Episodes now documented in government archives, hearings, and court records, and we'll ask a harder question. What did science actually show, and what did it not? Because myths grow in the gaps. Facts, explained clearly, take their power away. File 1, MKULTRA. The name reads like a comic book villain, but the program was real. In the early years of the Cold War, intelligence agencies panicked at the idea that minds could be bent like metal. Interrogation. Defection. Memory erasure. If the enemy had a serum or a technique that could pry open secrets or lock them, whoever discovered it first would own the future. In 1953, a sprawling research project took shape. More than 100 subcontracts to universities, private labs, and front organizations hunting for ways to alter behavior. The shopping list included barbiturates and amphetamines, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, electroshock, and a then-novel psychedelic, LSD. Here's the part that should make you uneasy. Some experiments used informed volunteers. Others did not. Doses were administered covertly in hospitals and safe houses. In one now infamous setup, sex workers were hired to bring men to apartments wired with two-way mirrors. Saw searchers could watch the effects of spiked drinks. The idea was as simple as it was wrong. Destabilize a mind, then steer it. Break memory, then rebuild it. If you're wondering whether this ever produced a reliable truth serum or a push-button method for control, the scientific answer is no. Psychedelics can increase suggestibility. They can shatter a sense of self. But their effects are chaotic, context-dependent, and frequently terrifying. They do not produce obedience on command. The brain is not a radio you can tune by twisting one chemical knob. After 2 decades, hearings dragged the program into the open, files were destroyed, and what remained painted a picture of hubris, harm, and a trail of ruined lives with no meaningful breakthroughs. The science didn't vindicate the dream of control, it documented its collapse. Why does MKUltra matter now? Because it shows the danger of asking scientific questions the wrong way. The right question is not, can we override autonomy? It's, how do we understand and protect it? Modern neuroscience, with its fMRI scans and optogenetics, maps networks that generate attention, memory, and emotion. It reveals how fragile those systems are and how easily they can be warped by stress, isolation, or trauma. Reframed ethically, the same knowledge that tempted abuse can guide treatment. Exposure therapy that rewires fear pathways. Psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, done with consent, preparation, and oversight. The difference isn't just the tool, it's the point. File 2, Operation Sea Spray. San Francisco, 1950. Dawn marine layer rolls in. Ships off the coast release aerosols, bacterial tracers chosen for their vivid color and presumed safety. So military scientists can model how a biological agent might drift over a city. The bacteria included Serratia marquescens, which produces a red pigment, and a bacillus cousin often used as a stand-in for anthrax in the lab. Sensors placed around the city charted how far the cloud traveled. The data were meant to improve ventilation systems, filters, and response plans. On paper, this was a dispersion study. In the air, it was an experiment performed on an unwitting population. Days later, a local hospital reported a rare cluster of Serratia infections. One patient died. Causation is still debated by historians. Some argue that the strain in the hospital may not match the one released, that background cases can surface by chance. Others point to the timing and the rarity and see a chain of events. The truth we can say out loud is this: even benign microbes can harm vulnerable people. Aerosol physics doesn't care about ethics, and the threshold for acceptable risk looks very different when the subjects don't know they're subjects. There's science inside this file too, good and bad. The good, modern aerosol studies, done transparently, saved lives during pandemics by clarifying how droplets and aerosols move, how ventilation dilutes them, and which masks block which particle sizes. The bad. In the mid-20th century, open-air tests cut ethical corners because researchers treated cities like wind tunnels. The lesson is boring and vital. You can learn how air carries danger without turning your neighbors into test dummies. File 3, Tuskegee. In 1932, public health officials in the United States began tracking black men with syphilis in rural Alabama to study the natural course of the disease. That phrasing, natural course, is where the horror hides. When penicillin became the standard cure in the 1940s, the treatment was not offered. The men were told they were receiving care. They weren't. They were examined, described, and deceived. Some died of a disease that had become treatable. Others passed it to their partners and children. Decades later, when the study was exposed, the damage was not just biological but social. Trust is a molecule too. It dissolves under certain conditions. It precipitates out slowly, if at all. What did science gain from this? Nothing it couldn't have learned ethically. We didn't need to withhold penicillin to understand that syphilis ravages the nervous system. We did need Tuskegee painfully to force reforms, informed consent documents that mean something, institutional review boards that include people outside the lab, community oversight in studies that affect communities, and a stance that research is not just the pursuit of knowledge, but a relationship with the public. In the decades since, clinical trials have become safer and fairer because of rules written in the ashes of Tuskegee. That does not undo the harm. It promises not to repeat it. Maybe you're thinking, these are ancient sins sealed in sepia-toned folders. But the reason they still pulse in today's feeds is simple. They hit the pressure points where science and power touch. Unchecked, curiosity can become entitlement. Urgent problems, war, pandemics, can be used to justify shortcuts. And when institutions say, trust us, they are asking for a currency some people cannot afford to spend without receipts. That's why declassification matters. It replaces rumors with records. It lets us separate the parts that really happened from the myths that grew around them. And it sets a standard for the rest of this journey. Every story we cover in this series has a body of evidence behind it. Hearing transcripts, FOIA releases, laboratory reports, or official histories written by the agencies that once stamped secret on their covers. Not every claim attached to these names is true, many are not. HAARP does not control the weather. Project Stargate did not prove psychic soldiers could read sealed documents. But these programs existed with budgets and line managers and practical goals. When we strip away the fantasy, what's left is stranger, and in some ways, more human. people trying to solve real problems. People making terrible decisions. People learning, sometimes too late, that methods matter more than headlines. So here's the spine of the episode. We'll move from intelligence labs to city streets, to hospital wards and back again. We'll separate "they did this" from "people say they did this." We'll keep asking the unglamorous questions. What was measured? Who consented? What did the data show? And when we get to the pieces that still attract the loudest rumors, the psychic spy program, the plan to blow up a nuclear device on the moon, the memo proposing false flag attacks, we'll let physics, statistics and paper trails do the talking. You don't have to believe everything you hear. You shouldn't. But when you see the stamps, the signatures and the equations, belief isn't the point. Understanding is. MKULTRA teaches why mind control broke on the rocks of biology. Sea spray teaches why safe microbes aren't safe for everyone and why aerosol science now has rules. Tuskegee teaches that the biggest variable in public health isn't just a pathogen, it's trust. In a moment, we'll open the next folder, the one full of targets and memos that almost turned conspiracy into policy, and ask the question this series keeps forcing. Not just was it real, but what does real mean when the stakes are human? Open the next folder, and the tone changes from lab coats to typewriters. Targets. Timelines. Draft language for speeches that were never delivered. This is the file that turns "they'd never do that" into "someone wrote it down." Operation Northwoods. Early 1962. A set of proposals drafted by senior defense officials for how to create a public pretext for military action against Cuba. The ideas ranged from propaganda to staged incidents, simulate hijackings, fake or even cause explosions at sea, plant evidence, blame it on a hostile power. Read the pages today and it feels like a screenplay that should have been thrown out in the first meeting. But it wasn't a movie pitch. It went up the chain. It was briefed. And then, this part matters, it was rejected. The plan never became policy, and the documents were declassified decades later. What do we do with that? First, distinguish proposal from execution. Second, notice the friction. Yes, people in rooms can normalize bad ideas. No, institutions don't always let them out of the room. Third, ask the science question buried in the politics. Why do false flags seem plausible to crowds even when they're rare? Because humans are pattern hunters. When an explanation is emotionally satisfying and fits a known template, our brains overestimate its prior probability. The antidote is boring. Demand evidence that crosses the line from could have to did. Names, orders, logistics, receipts. File 4, Project A19. Late 1950s, dawn of the space race. One proposal on a military desk asked a theatrical question. What if we detonated a small nuclear device on the moon's surface where telescopes could see the flash? The rationale was psychological: demonstrate technical reach, boost domestic morale, intimidate rivals. Scientists were approached to model plume height and brightness. One young researcher, whose name would later be famous, contributed calculations about dust visibility from Earth. It never happened. The proposal died on the vine, replaced by another idea that turned out to be smarter propaganda. Plant a flag, not a crater. Why didn't A19 go forward? Physics and optics do some of the vetoing. A nuke in a vacuum is not the Hollywood fireball, you know. No atmosphere, no mushroom cloud, just a hard flash and a debris plume that obeys ballistic arcs. The moon's escape velocity is low enough that some ejector could achieve temporary orbits. The rest would rain down, painting a scar that says more about our impatience than our power. More importantly, The political blowback on Earth would drown out any win. But there's a deeper lesson. Science can model spectacle. It can't model meaning. An equation will tell you how high dust rises. It can't tell you whether the world will call you brilliant or monstrous for putting it there. File 5, the Psychic Spy Program, best known under its late name Project Stargate. During the Cold War, rumors circulated that the Soviets were studying telepathy and remote viewing, people attempting to describe hidden targets at a distance. In response, US agencies funded experiments at Stanford Research Institute and later other labs. Protocols evolved. A viewer sits in a room, a randomly selected target, a photograph, a location, is chosen elsewhere, and the viewer draws or describes impressions without feedback until the session ends. Sometimes the sketches looked eerily similar to the target. Sometimes they didn't. Proponents saw hits that defied chance. Skeptics saw noise and pattern matching. Decades in, an outside review asked the question intelligence work ultimately cares about. Did it produce actionable information you couldn't have gotten otherwise? The answer, across memos and case summaries, was no. Whatever small effects appeared in carefully designed trials didn't survive replication or operational stress. Here's where statistics help sort wonder from wish. If you run thousands of trials, a few will land near the bullseye by chance. If your judging rubric allows partial credit, looks like water when the target is a bridge, humans award points beyond what a blind algorithm would. If you publish the hits and leave the misses in a drawer, the literature starts to lean. These are not insults, they're human habits. Science builds guardrails around them. Pre-registration, blinding, rigorous controls, and, most crucial, predictive power that beats baselines. The Cold War psychic files are fascinating as cultural artifacts. As scientific evidence for a new sense, they remain what they were, suggestive anecdotes without a mechanism and without consistent, above-chance performance when the rules are tight. Back to Earth. Literally. File 6, the human radiation experiments of the 1940s-1960s. In the early atomic era, doctors and government researchers asked urgent questions with blunt tools. How does iodine-131 move through the thyroid? How does plutonium distribute in bone? How dangerous is fallout? The fastest way to get answers was the worst way. Dose patients, often without meaningful consent, and measure. Some were terminally ill and told little, some were institutionalized, some were pregnant. Others lived downwind of test sites while officials downplayed risk. In the 1990s, an advisory committee dug through boxes, traced names, and wrote a report with a simple conclusion. Necessity and secrecy had been used to justify violating basic human dignity. Out of that reckoning came clearer consent standards, dose limits, and a suspicion of secrecy ethos in medical research. Again, the lesson isn't that science is dangerous. It's that science without consent is something else, no matter how noble the spreadsheet looks. File 7, HAARP, the High-Frequency Active Auroral Research Program in Alaska. To some corners of the internet, it's a weather machine or a mind control array. To radiophysicists, it's a powerful transmitter that heats tiny patches of the ionosphere, so we can study how radio waves behave in a dynamic plasma. The experiments are loud on specialized receivers and silent to your brain. The energy densities in the sky are minuscule compared to sunlight and ordinary auroral currents. The facility hosts open houses. University researchers publish the spectra and results. Why do the myths stick? Because the device is big, the physics is invisible, and "I don't understand that" easily becomes "they must be hiding something." The cure is a field trip and a spectrum analyzer. You can hear the transmissions if you tune a shortwave radio to the experiment frequency, and you can see the ionospheric response on instruments around the world. What you can't do is steer a hurricane. The power budgets aren't in the same universe. Before we close part 2, let's go back to a pattern you might be seeing. Each of these files blends 3 ingredients: fear, novelty, and a kernel of truth that can be stretched into a legend. Fear of rivals, disease, the unknown. Novelty, new tools, nukes, psychedelics, high-frequency transmitters, statistics that outpace our intuitions and ethics. The kernel of truth, a memo that proposed a bad idea, a lab that ran a risky test, a facility built for one purpose that looks to outsiders like it could serve another. The job of a curiosity channel isn't to laugh off the legends or to swallow them whole. It's to pull the receipts and then ask what the receipts don't show. So here is what the receipts show so far. Yes, a false flag plan was drafted and rejected. Conspiratorial thinking thrives when people don't learn the rejected part. Yes, someone pitched nuking the moon. Equations said what the plume would look like. History said no. Yes, governments funded psychic research. The best trials didn't beat chance when rules were tight and intelligence agencies moved on. Yes, mid-century scientists dosed people with radioactive tracers without consent. Medicine now has fences built from that shame. And yes, HAARP exists. Its beams make the sky ring like a bell in math, not in weather. In part 3, we'll turn to the cases that mix secrecy with statistics, mass surveillance programs that were once rumors and are now exhibits, open-air dispersion trials beyond San Francisco that seeded entire regions with inert tracers, and the quiet, unglamorous scientific method you can use at home to tell a scary story from a documented one. We'll end with a short checklist for viewers: how to read a declassified document, how to spot the jump from proposed to done, and how to keep your curiosity sharp without letting it be hijacked by noise. Because the truth isn't less interesting than the myth. It's harder, and that's what makes it worth chasing.